Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday morning. Time for the first half of The Outsiders, following what the papers say. Okay, beginning with what the papers say.
And this morning we see laid out on the front pages of the nation's Sunday newsprint that vast Australian cultural gulf, the lines of belief that divide us. Football, of course. And it takes a special kind of Sydney-centric bloody-mindedness to construct a Sunday Telegraph front page that all but ignores that little event that drew 100,000 fans to the MCG yesterday. And never mind that Hawthorn has won 2 in a row before a national TV audience of millions. In the mind of the Sunday telly, all of that is eclipsed as
car horns are ringing out across Belmore and drums playing as hundreds of Bulldog fans gathered in the streets to celebrate their team's passage to the NRL Grand Final.
Which will be next week, of course. In Brisbane, the Sunday Mail could really care less about either code, consigning the AFL to a piece of none too subtle wordplay.
Hawks pluck swans.
Sport, while dwelling on the bigger issues.
Why fighting breast cancer is so personal for Sarah Murdoch.
No quibbles or equivocation for the Sunday Herald Sun, witches or hawks, cups and kissing this morning.
Easy prey,
being the Melbourne paper's neat summary of the Sydney Swans capitulation. It's all about the winning, of course, and back in Sydney, the Sun Herald does the best it can to draw a positive.
Buddy brave, but swans clawed by hawks.
While at the Sunday Tasmanian, they're making the most of their sponsorship ties to the Hawthorn Club.
The victorious Hawks are bringing the AFL Premiership Cup to Tasmania after a stunning 63-point demolition of the Swans in yesterday's grand final.
Yes, there's something in the Hawthorn win for almost everyone. It must be said that wall-to-wall sport makes a nice change from our recent tabloid diet of near-hysterical jihad beat-up, which is not to say that ours is still not a land stalked by fear, hate and terror. It's just that today it's slipped back inside the newspapers, presumably only for a moment. Not that the papers are not doing their bit in the war to make terror.
Home front terror. Elite Australian soldiers fear extremists will target their families while they fight terrorists in the Middle East.
That's the piece running in this morning's Murdoch tabs, a piece that manages to assure us that
elite commandos sent to the Middle East to lead Australia's part in the fight against terror fear they're leaving their families vulnerable to attack by extremists.
While not actually quoting a single soldier or military representative,
it is understood
is as close as it gets, give or take the occasional
soldiers believe,
and
one source said,
which is not to say that there isn't an abundance of evidence to support the story's claim of home front terror.
Mysterious strangers have visited Defence Department homes in suburbs near the military barracks in Holsworthy and nearby Steel Barracks in Moorebank with vague or implausible excuses.
Clearly, we are a nation on a knife edge. For further proof, there's this in the Sunday Herald Sun.
Eddie Maguire says he saw an AFP officer reach for his gun when a Virgin Australian plane flew low over the MCG as part of the grand final celebrations.
Alert and alarmed. To 10 outsiders coming up. Let's see though who's on the money. It's time to reveal our tweet of the week.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not.
Yes, indeedy, 19 away from 10, and joining you for Outsiders this morning, a journalist, Miriam Cosick, lawyer and Army Officer Glenn Mohammed, and journalist Derek Parker. Good morning to you all. Here's a bit from this week's To and Fro.
Every reasonable Australian knows that there is a very few
a very few misguided Australians, for reasons we can't fully understand, brought up in this marvellous country, who've been attracted to an extreme and fanatical ideology. There's no honour in crime and violence. There's no dignity in inflicting death here. If we want to starve extremists of oxygen, this country doesn't have time to play cheap rabble-rousing games. What we need now from the mainstream political parties of Australia is moderation, not extremism. And by contrast, at the heart of every terrorist group is an infatuation with death. What else can explain the beheadings, crucifixions, mass executions, rapes and sexual slavery in every town and city that's fallen to the terrorist movement now entrenched in eastern Syria and northern Iraq? A terrorist movement calling itself Islamic State insults Islam, and it mocks the duties of a legitimate state towards its citizens. And to use this term is to dignify a death cult that in declaring itself a caliphate has declared war on the world. Miriam Cossack, it's a funny balance, isn't it, between the two messages we seem to be getting from our politicians. We're at war against the embodiment of evil, but stay calm.
I know. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Derek. Hi, Glenn.
Good morning.
The thing I find, I don't know. I don't know if anyone else is feeling this, but I'm getting a real feeling of surreality in the last week. The way the Prime Minister is ratcheting up the drama of his language, I find terrifying, because it's making us feel not calm, it's making us feel frightened. I'm feeling frightened, and I don't believe him. But then we've got the leader of the opposition, who I actually think that little grab you played was absolutely the voice of moderation. But his delivery, Jonathan, is so soft. It's so banal. It just doesn't stand up to Tony Abbott's, really kind of biblical message. I think that's a big problem.
Brian here. I think in those two quotes, they were talking about different things. I think Bill Shorten was talking about people in Australia, where it is clearly a very small minority doing very criminal things. Whereas Tony Abbott, which I think was his UN speech, was talking about ISIS and the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Those are rather different subjects, I think, and I'm not too sure that comparing one quote with another without realising that is really the right.
That's absolutely a fair point. Though also from the PM, I mean, he's capable of that sort of rhetoric, the embodiment of evil, while saying that we should remain insouciantly Australian. I'm not sure how those two things are readily compatible.
Well, if you're saying, and Miriam, you said you were scared by the rhetoric about the Islamic State. Well, you probably should be. These are fairly scary guys. They're a pretty nutty genocidal bunch, and we've seen that in their attempts to wipe out the Yazidis, the Syrian Kurds. The Iraqi Kurds will probably be next on the list, and they'll make the list as long as they want it. So yeah, I think we should be scared of those people. I'm not saying that you should apply that same message to the people in Australia who are obviously somewhat deranged individuals. That's a rather different message. But
what's the appropriate, Glenn, sense of proportion in this? I mean, we've seen a pretty worrying attack this week in suburban Melbourne. Yes. But that's hardly that sort of existential threat. These are individuals acting in nasty ways, and yet there's a sense that we should respond to that with almost a sort of a collective state of heightened anxiety. Is that appropriate?
I think the state of anxiety is too high. It shouldn't. Within Australia, I think we don't have an existential threat as we're being told. ISIS is a problem in the Middle East. Middle East has had ongoing problems for a long time, and it's just an extension of what has been happening for the last 2 decades at least. As far as what we have within Australia, at the moment, the focus needs to shift on finding out why elements of Islamic community are feeling left out, are feeling left behind, are feeling isolated, and targeting that. There is an element of criminality in the actions they want to take, but the way I look at it is a lot of them, the demographic I'm looking at, are young, misguided individuals who are easily brainwashed into taking a certain stance. And there's not much to distinguish between fundamentalist elements or extremist elements within the Australian society, like ADL, who want to target people based on what they believe and these guys were being brainwashed into targeting individuals based on what they believe. So there's a little bit of a clash going on both sides over there.
And Miriam, there seems to be a big play being made, though, on fear, that the subtleties of the situation, as Glenn points out there, are a bit lost on the front pages of the papers, for example.
I say I agree with Glenn, and when I see some of what these young men are getting up to, I just think they're, typical testosterone-driven young men with nowhere to place their energies. They could be getting into a fight at a nightclub at 3 a.m. and knifing somebody there, or they could be just, grabbing onto this ideology, which clearly has nothing to do with Islam as it is practiced by millions of people around the world. But one of the things that's really struck me when you talk about fear is that both in the politicians' pronouncements and especially in the media coverage of it, there seems to be a kind of edge of excitement, as if we're suddenly in the main game. And frankly, I would rather we were still the boring backwater that, Australian intellectuals used to rebel against 20 or 30 years ago.
Crisis, not something you want to let go to waste.
Is there a sense of that, Derek? I mean, it's an interesting point you make. I mean, we have papers, the media making a lot of this crisis, and that, let's not forget, as a media which is struggling for audience and struggling for attention, this, in a funny and cynical way, couldn't come at a better time.
Well, everyone loves to have headlines about crisis, disaster, danger looming, imminent Armageddon. It's good media. So you can get very easily carried away with that, and that can be quite dangerous. It can become a rather self-fulfilling prophecy. And we should remember as well that some of the terrorist acts that we've seen, both emanating from the Middle East and some of the things that have been planned here in Australia, are indeed being planned as media events. I mean, these beheadings are, they're done as media stunts through social media. And sometimes I think the mainstream media should be wary of pushing this along too far, because you can almost see that they're encouraging the people perpetrating these events or seeking to perpetrate these events by just participating in that headline process. But maybe there is another issue here, and Glenn touched on Newman Hayter. It may provide a certain silver lining here in helping us to understand how people get radicalised, and in his case, very quickly, really, for no obvious reason. He came from a stable, loving household. His brothers appeared to be non-radicals. So maybe by studying that case in a bit more detail, we can understand how that process happened. And there have been some countries around the world, Germany in particular, which have put in very good strategies, well, I don't know, very good, but effective strategies of de-radicalisation. And it may be that if we can understand the causes of radicalisation and look at some of those models being used elsewhere, we can help to preempt it, identify people at an early stage, and maybe with the help of the moderate Muslim community, steer them away from those dangerous paths.
Our response, Glenn Mohammed, so far seems to fall into all these traps which have us behaving in the way in which ISIS might have us behave.
That's exactly what they want. It's divide and conquer. It's very simple. You're just splintering across. Within Muslim community, you're dividing it up: moderate, extremist, fundamentalist, left wing. And then within Australian society itself, you're dividing it up based on race, religion, culture. And that's what they want. They want to create that conflict. And by doing that, we're exactly playing in their hands, and that's giving them what they want. Now, ultimately, to me, Miriam, you said earlier where it's nothing to do with Islam. I disagree with that point. There's certain elements within Islam where it's so easy to take it out of context and justify these sort of actions within the religion itself. And that is up to the Muslim community. This is where Islamic leaders come into the picture, where they need to be able to make it clear that these issues were dealt with, or these points were dealt with within the religion over the last 1400 years.
I mean, fundamentalism is always about the core religion, whether that be fundamentalist Christianity or fundamentalist Islam. It still has its roots.
It does, and it's very easy within Islam to take a verse from the Quran, for example.
Here endeth part 1